Okay, hello everybody. I am John Adams. Like Andy said, I used to work at Twitter. These days, I was an information security lead over there. I was one of the original members of the operations team at Twitter, so basically every time from 2006 until about 2011, if you saw the fail whale, it was probably my problem and the rest of my team's problem. I currently work for the Open Technology Fund. The Open Technology Fund is a US government group that takes federal funds, and we take that money and we apply it to problems that allow for solutions where we try to solve the problem of creating more democracy and more communication on the internet. So for example, we put funding into things like Tor, we fund Signal to a certain extent, and then we also work on projects like visibility into the internet, so you can check that out. The other thing I do is I fight for the users. Much like Tron, I am trying to spend every waking moment of my time trying to make the internet a better and safer place. But lately, there's been a lot of conversation about artificial intelligence. And artificial intelligence is basically taking computers and using them to do human-like tasks, usually defined as the science of making computers do things that would normally require human intelligence. However, AI is not a panacea. It doesn't fix everything. It's not what's called AGI, so artificial general intelligence, but it is very good in certain limited domains. So like if we're solving chess problems, we're solving game problems, we're trying to do some predictive or statistical analysis, it has been very useful. Other examples are things like, recently AlphaGo actually won the game of Go, which was a highly intractable computer science problem for a long time. First chess was a big problem, and then Go was a big problem. IBM Watson is a very interesting attempt at artificial intelligence, but what it is it's sort of like machine learning coupled with an expert system. So it sort of creates a probability of what the best Jeopardy answer is, or a probability of what possible cancer you might have based upon a certain amount of inputs, but it's not a general purpose artificial intelligence system. Same thing goes for item recommendation. Most people originally were introduced to item recommendation on things like Amazon.com back in the 90s. Amazon used statistical methods. They were not exactly artificial intelligence. Those of you who are interested in this sort of thing might look up Bayesian analysis or inverse cosine analysis for relationship matching. But it's a trick of the math and less of a actual computer brain. We see artificial intelligence used in a lot of fields, everything from data security, personal security. We see a lot of HFT work, high frequency trading happens in the stock market now. So lightning fast microsecond trades driven by machines. Is it intelligence? Not really. Does it make a lot of money for people? I'm sure it does. It's also used in marketing personalization, which is what a lot of you are probably interested in if you're a designer. From my standpoint, the security standpoint, I look at things like automatic fraud detection, and then we have things like search and the machine vision problem that smart cars have to deal with. Yesterday, and I don't want to single anybody out, but I heard someone say the Turing test had been solved, or that the Turing test was completed, and the answer is no. The Turing test is not solved. In 1950, Alan Turing said, if a computer can fool 30% of the people and make 30% of the people believe that they're talking to a machine, so if I picked up my smartphone or a dumb terminal and I talked to a computer, could the computer actually do a convincing job of telling me that it was a machine? The answer to that is no. There was a Ukrainian, it was like a 13-year-old boy simulation. He was a 13-year-old Ukrainian boy that answered a few questions correctly on the University of University of Reading's Turing test. So Turing actually never put any parameters around what it meant to pass the Turing test, but I assure you it hasn't been solved. We don't have machine intelligence that adequately simulates what human intelligence is yet. What we do have is a lot of stuff like this. Most people, we have if-then-else statements. They have a trigger, they emit a response, and then they do something else if the response is not triggered. This is the common sort of fallacy that chatbots are somehow a form of artificial intelligence. They're not. They're a series of keyword-based responses to a set of very select and defined questions. So if you have something that says, I am missing my order, and the system comes back and says, oh, what is your order number? That's not intelligence. That's an artificial intelligence. That's an if-then-else statement. The real question about, kind of comes up again and again is, will we ever succeed in having true AI? Yeah, someday, maybe. We have a lot of problems to solve. Currently, computer hardware, even though as great as it is incredibly weak. We have nothing that simulates this wonderful computer we have sitting atop our shoulders. AI, up until the last few years, has had relatively minimal funding. I believe last year was the first year it actually crossed over a $1 billion amount. And the difficulty of integrating all of these systems together, like if I'm building a smart car, I have a very defined set of parameters where I say, okay, I have a car, it can't hit any obstacles, it has to go down the road, it must go to this destination, I have GPS, and I'm integrating 30 or 40 systems together, including machine vision, to make that object go from point A to point B without killing anybody. Kind of a hard problem, but still a well-defined problem. It's not like what you do every morning when you wake up and you have the ability to grab things, to identify objects, to move around the room, to have this level of extremely high consciousness autonomy that you exist with. And we still haven't really agreed on what true AI is. It is a number of smaller things, but we don't actually have a good definition. And the thing is, this is kind of the funding graph. This is coming out of a lot of incubators and startups, but I think 2016 was kind of the closest graph I could get. So Q2 2016, we finally saw us crossing $1 billion in AI research. Okay, so that's all interesting, but what's the fun stuff? The fun stuff is that most AI needs big data to learn. And probably, if you follow the tech press, you firmly believe that big data is a brand new thing that's really amazing and that just came out, and oh my God, I have to learn about big data, and man, I should drop everything tomorrow morning and go to Galvanize and become a data scientist. Well, I got news for you. This is one of the first data scientists. This is John Snow. Do you know what John Snow did? John Snow was a statistician, and he was, what's that? Oh, sorry. So he understood statistics, and he actually painted a map using census data of all the people in London, and he identified where all of the cholera was coming from. So in 1821, I believe, everyone was getting sick from cholera, and no one knew why. So there's a great book on this called The Ghost Map, which I love. It's awesome. But basically, they didn't have the germ theory of disease yet. So Snow sat down, mapped out all the cholera disease, mapped out where the people were, took it all, did this with pencil and paper, and then discovered, hey, guess what? Everyone's been getting their water from the same well. And inside that well is the remnants of all the runoff from all the markets, all the dead bodies. Those people got cholera because they all drank from the same place. And his work began the germ theory of disease. So the thing is statistics are incredibly important, and we can use statistics to simulate what intelligence is. And if you look at Google and you look at Twitter, there's an incredible amount of data that's currently being stored. Okay, so Google right now has about 1 million petabytes, and more than 24 petabytes a day of data are collected from the internet. Around the time that I left Google, we were doing about 32 billion searches a day, and we believe that 90% of worldwide data has been created in the last 2 years, and that this number is continually doubling. 2012, we said it's going to double every year, and we also said that by 2020, we think there's going to be 40 zettabytes of data. So I know this is confusing because I can't remember this all the time, and I work in numbers all day, but megabytes down there, that's what you got at home, and then down here is zettabytes, and then someday maybe we'll get to Bronto bytes, and I always think of like Fred Flintstone when I see that, because of like Bronto burgers, but it's an incredibly large number. So, zettabytes, 2 to the power of 70, massive, massive number. Okay, so what's big data? What's big data in today's world? And it's basically being able to take all of these large-scale data sets and analyze relationships together. And the thing is that, again, as I said before, it's nothing new. Data brokers have been doing this. John Snow did this. And what's actually changed, the big changes, is that storage and compute is cheap. So if you tried to build a streaming video service in 1991, or around there, I'll say probably 97. The thing is that you wouldn't have been able to buy large amounts of disk storage. It would have been very expensive. I think 20 gigs was a pipe dream. Having computers with the ability to transcode media, that was huge. The thing is, we have faster CPUs now. I have more computing power here and probably sitting in that camera than we have that ran, the Apollo mission, or that ran other famous, missions. We also have open source tools. So like Google has TensorFlow. TensorFlow is a system for being able to do large scale analysis on data sets. Hadoop is a wonderful tool for doing distributed information processing. And all of this sort of stuff ties together in what's called the big data lifecycle. So, we collect a bunch of data, we consolidate it together, we do analysis on it, and then we use it. And this repeats itself. Now, there's a lot of problems in this cycle because depending upon how you treat your users and where the data goes, all kinds of things can happen. AI kind of focuses on these last two, on consolidating data and doing analytics on the data. But the real change is like we have more volume, we have more variety of data, and we have more velocity of data. So once we have this sort of thing happening where we have more information coming in, then we can enable learning. And we can actually make systems learn. But again, not human learning, it's still artificial. There's a lot of trade-offs, and I apologize if you can't read the text, but I'll summarize it. A little bright in here. The thing about data is as you collect more and more information on your users, you essentially create this storage which is subject to law enforcement. It's subject to things like subpoena and warrants. Now, if you run a business and you have information that shows where somebody was or that has location data, I could go to a court and I could get a subpoena for that information. If I wanted to get the content of someone's communication, I could go and get a warrant. And the reason why I can get that data is because you have it. But the idea is, in general, we don't want to retain data. The less time we spend holding on to data, the less information we have, and the more protected the users are. This is a quote which is a bit long, but it's from Mr. Podesta. I'm sure you've all remember him from the email scandal. But the thing is that there were a couple of reports that were issued by the Obama administration, and I urge you to go and read them because they're really great. You can just do Obama big data, you'll find it. But the thing is that we have near ubiquitous data collection. Like, there is a service that probably knows the location of every single person in this room. If I went to AT&T and I subpoenaed your records, I know where you are, or whomever your carrier is. The FTC saw issues with this, that there were benefits and risk to using large data sets and storing data, and that as you introduce long-term data storage along with machines, you start to create new risks, in fact, risks we may not even have ever seen before. How many people in this room have used a credit card and had the credit card turned off while you were traveling? Okay, so that's an example of machine-based fraud detection that incorrectly targeted you, and that's a minor inconvenience, but it could get worse. So for example, like some people, and this is all, the next two slides come from the FTC's report. So some people could be mistakenly denied opportunities, like you might not be able to get a loan, you might not be able to go to a particular school, or you might not be able to get funding from the government because machine learning and sorting has failed. And like one thing is like there were companies that were lowering the credit limits of individuals, not based upon the actions that an individual took, but it was based upon actions of people that were sort of in the cohort class of people around them. Machine learning can create or reinforce disparities in society. It's not all good, but then again, it's not all bad either. And this is kind of a famous saying about technology, right? Technology is neutral, but it's not good and it's not bad. So, it's not good or bad. The other thing is like exposure of sensitive information. So we've seen the case with with Venmo, where like I know every transaction you've done and why you've done it because it's in the public, which maybe it shouldn't be. Same thing goes for like assisting and targeting consumers for fraud. So if I break into your Facebook account, I can use the information and the interest graph and your friend data that Facebook has accumulated on you to then create social engineering attacks against you. I could very easily forge a message from who I think your boss is or who I think your parents are to make you act upon it. So I could say something like, oh man, you have to click on this link right now because the entire world's going to end and you're going to get fired if you don't click this link. And then you get malware and then a minute later I pop a shell on your box and it's all over. It also creates like new justifications for exclusion. So like individuals might not be able to get certain benefits because of the way these systems are. From the consumer side and from the company side, the risks are a little different. A lot of people don't understand what it means when they enter information into a form. Most things on the internet, you should just assume they're public and infinite and they're not going anywhere. And there's a certain belief that this level of transparency that people have, and this is sort of espoused in books like David Brim's The Transparent Society, which is a book I completely disagree with. But in that book, I'm kind of a privacy Nazi, sorry. Well, privacy advocate, I'm not gonna say Nazi. But the idea is like, by being transparent, we get more information out of the network. So like if I give Google my location, maybe Google can tell me what stores are nearby, but then Google remembers that I was at that location forever. That might not be good. There's also things like locational privacy. A lot of people forget about this. Like as you're transmitting data about your current GPS location, you are storing that data forever in a system somewhere that you may not have any control over. And I want to stress this, that privacy loss, like the loss of your privacy, does not occur by just a one-time event. As you give more and more information to the network, privacy loss occurs by the aggregation and by putting this data together. From the company side of things, a lot of people think that it's possible to store data and then anonymize it and then sort of process it in some way. And I'll show you something later that happened in the very early days with a company that we acquired at Twitter that had a lot of problems with anonymizing data. And you might have heard of some of the things like Target. Like Target had a famous example where by collecting advertising data, they were able to tell a family that their daughter was pregnant before she told them because of their purchase history. So that's kind of interesting. It's also very easy to mistake patterns for reality. And then as we've seen lately with the algorithmic timelines on Facebook and Twitter, it's very simple to assume that the filter bubble is real. Also, we go back to sort of like Science 101, where like the things that you discover as a company by looking at data might not be true. Correlation is not always causation. That's basic science. And in some cases, collecting this data and processing it may create an ethical dilemma. One thing that someone said to me yesterday, which I kind of threw in here last minute, was you actually may have a different view of the world because the way that you see the world because of your ethnic history, or your upbringing and your world, you don't think, like for example, something might be bad, but in another culture it might be bad. So this brings us back to the diversity problem in tech, which is like different viewpoints, different cultures have different ways of looking at the data set. So you have to be careful with that as well. Okay. First thing is, I want to just deviate for a second. There are very, very few places in the United States that have a law about what you can do with data. The only people that are really out there protecting the consumer are some of the laws that have happened in states, of which California is the only one that has an inalienable right to privacy. That does not exist in any of the other states. That's Article 1, Section 1 of the California Constitution. Incredible. First thing, privacy. Let's write that down. And then there's a lot of other legislation, but the only people that are really sticking up for us right now are people like the FTC. And even then, the FTC is more of a consumer org. They're not looking out for privacy. So I'm not a lawyer, but I urge you to read some of these acts. The FTC has a number of laws that prohibit unfair and deceptive practices. In the health industry, we have HIPAA. So if you're doing design work or working on stuff for HIPAA, you may have to have special messaging for that. We do have the Fair Credit Reporting Act, and then there is the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, which is a terrible law. It doesn't offer privacy. It actually has so many loopholes in it that your employer can just cite EPCA as a reason for monitoring you at work. It was a terrible time for privacy. It happened in the 80s. It probably needs to be revisited. Okay, so a couple more things. Anyone ever heard this term before? Surveillance capitalism. Surveillance capitalism, if you work for a company that does advertising, is how you get paid. Surveillance capitalism is a method of collecting data on the user, holding it in the aggregate, using the data to target advertising, and then gaining monetary gain. You can do this. I'm not going to say I'm against it, but I would say that you can do it and you can still respect the user and have a level of consent for the user. The Internet Advertising Board is a self-regulatory board, so they created this thing called self-regulatory principles for behavioral advertising. So they have these 4 rules. If you are collecting advertising data on users, educate them, tell them what you're collecting. That's part of a good privacy policy. Be transparent, make sure they know what you collect. Securely store the data once you have it. And we always joke about this in the security industry because we say, oh, you know what you should do? You should collect all the data on the users, and then once you have it, make sure no one else can get it. It's kind of funny. But true, sadly true. And then, of course, let consumers control their data. If a consumer says, I want to delete myself from your service, give them the ability to click a delete button and wipe out everything about them. And that includes collected offline advertising data and other things. Be transparent. It's the right thing to do. There was a FTC law a little while back called COPA, Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. And a lot of this has to do with applying those principles and codifying some of them when you're dealing with users that are under 18. So you might want to research that if you have a website that caters to customers or caters to children or otherwise. Okay, a couple quick little things. I've already mentioned data retention. I think that that you can probably gain a lot of information about users by storing what's called quantitative results. So if you store counts, aggregate information, totals, probably pretty good. You probably don't need to hold the data for every user for until the end of time, but some companies do this. Companies also have issues with what I would call dark patterns in design. The first example I ever saw of this was I have an opt-in box, but by default it's checked. That's just reprehensible. Why would you do that? Oh, I know why, because I want to get more people on my marketing list. But it's actually illegal under the CAN Spam Act to have default opt-in. The user has to make a conscious choice to opt in. So you're not supposed to do that. I've seen applications on Android and otherwise that ask for an incredibly large set of permissions out of the gate. You probably don't need all those permissions. We like to stress again and again in security about this thing called least privilege. So like if you design an application, only ask for the privileges you need. Don't ask for any more, any less. If you need more, ask the user again. And I know that might impact growth, but be careful of how you work with the user. This all kind of comes back to consent. Like, do you have the consent of the user to do what you're doing? There's also a lot of issues around software that does like dynamic pricing and directed selling. So for example, maybe if you don't really understand the user, you could impact low-income users by making something more expensive when it's less expensive for someone who has a higher income. People don't understand they're doing this, but this may be a bad result of the algorithm. The problems with a lot of this is that if we wanted to make AI and big data more, let's say, more kind, more filled with consent, we may have to be more transparent. Companies may have to show their hand and show what they're collecting and why. This may actually not work because some companies have competition and they don't want to reveal what they're doing. So it really kind of inhibits our ability to monitor and keep track of data, and it may actually make auditing and compliance more difficult. I'm going to skip that slide. Okay, so I want to close with some kind of big data blunders, which I've seen. This is in 2006, AOL, and this is actually the people that worked at this company started a company called Surmise, which in 2008 became the first search engine on Twitter. But those individuals, they actually at one point had released the search output of AOL to a bunch of researchers. And the researchers were able to identify something like 50% of the individuals just by looking at what they had searched for in the aggregate. So this was after the data had been anonymized. They were able to still identify individuals. It's kind of interesting. And this actually came from This Week. Amazon's considering giving developers access to raw transcripts of what people say using Alexa. So that means, Alexa's continually recording and uploading blobs of audio to Amazon. So if you own an Echo, you own an Alexa, that data is sitting on a server, and in that server, that data could be subpoenaed, or in this case, could be given to developers, which is kind of frightening. In a more kind of, messing with our election problem, anyone know what Deep Root Analytics is? So this company had, there was a consultant that discovered a misconfigured database that Deep Root Analytics was using to collect voter data. And they were actually able to log into that database over the web, no protection, no security, and get the names, date of birth, home address, phone numbers, and voter registration details of everyone in the US. So here we have a case of big data accidentally exposed to the internet, able to download for everyone. And then this is one of my kind of scary stories, but this is in 2012. We had about 20 million tweets on Hurricane Sandy at Twitter. And the thought is if you were to take this tweet data set and say, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to look at all the tweets that are flowing through the service, and I'm going to try to figure out where I need to send all of my first responders to try to help people. And the question is like, which city services should I send based on tweets? Well, it turned out that like the greatest number of tweets actually came from Manhattan, which is where everyone has redundant internet access, you know, it's in a major city, everything's built up. And the places like out in New Jersey and the surrounding areas, you know, machine learning says send all the troops to Manhattan because that's where the most tweets are coming from. But the reality is we got very few messages from severely impacted neighborhoods because they couldn't use the phones anymore. They couldn't get to the internet. And you know, the data did not accurately reflect the real world. It only reflected the social media world, which the results of that was quite dubious. You know, you weren't getting signal from impacted communities because they couldn't get out there. So, in closing, AI is a nascent, immature field. And the only way that we're going to be able to make it work and make it be useful to people is if we look at things like ethics, capacity planning, security, safety, and all of these things as you're planning out AI or other things for your company. It should be part of your learning efforts and part of your trainings. And you know, the future is on you. So, thank you. Any questions? Questions? Yeah, go get a microphone. I still think AI does a lot of good. I just got to scare people once in a while.
Boo. Here you go.
So in terms of security and privacy,
Yeah.
who actually owns the data? Interesting
question. Depending upon the company, because the companies are in the service and you as a private citizen are using that service, the company owns the data. However, like, you know, we used to say a thing, we had a thing in all of our terms of service at Twitter that said, you know, you own your own tweets, you own your own data. This is an interesting proposition because sometimes you have a service that goes out of business and then they want to sell the data. So who has the right to sell the data, right? And actually the one thing that happens a lot of times is you input all your data into a service, the company runs out of funding, and then guess what is a really good funding source? Is to sell all the names and addresses. So like that's an issue. But they own that data and there's not a court in the land that would stop them. So if you want to have a world in which the user owns their data, you should have that in your policy in the terms of service, that you don't own their data and that they own their data.
To follow up on that question, Facebook and Twitter, they have a download a copy of your data, and
Sure.
LinkedIn does as well. But they only give you a small portion of the whole entire.
No, Twitter does a full export, as does Facebook.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, no,
Google also has a thing, and there's actually a team inside of Google called the Google Data Liberation Front. And they actually, like my wife works at the EFF, and they gave her a pair of bolt cutters that says, you know, Google Data Liberation Front. So she has those in her office. But yeah, they've actually been really good about allowing for export. But the problem there is that I believe, you know, in the previous question, yes, you can export it, but you don't own it because it's on their site. So, over here.
Yeah. Hold on, wait. Come on.
Yeah.
Thanks. So on the question of like retaining the data for the least possible time, it's obviously really cut and dried if we're talking about, say, VPN providers and so on. You know, there's no need to hold on to that data. But what about the counterpoint of like, you know, one, the sort of value of historical record, and say, you know, if companies are not holding on to data for a certain amount of time, and then we later discover that they might be guilty of some like great malfeasance, then we actually have no way to go back and kind of have that argument.
I think that probably internal records would suffice for that, but you know, as far as like long-term data collection on particular user data, I think primarily when I speak about that, I'm talking about PII, and that's publicly identifiable information. So, you know, like your name, your address, your phone number, your IP address, and a timestamp, you probably shouldn't keep that data for a long time. I don't think that would be useful. Now, I will tell you that the other side of this, my side of this from a person in the security community, is, like with security breaches, we would frequently not be able to identify that a breach had occurred. And I think if you look at the Mandiant report from last year, they say the average time to breach detection in an enterprise is like 6 months. So if you were only holding data for a month, maybe you can't track malware. So I think that, like a lot of companies, the usual retention policy is like 2 years. So, but that's up to you and your lawyers. So
I have another question. Taking the stage. No, actually, so Yahoo recently came up with a solution which was passwordless entry, where they use.
Oh God.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, do you think and there's a bunch of studies about like the idea of going for not having a password. What do you think about that in terms of UI?
I think that if anyone asks you to build a system that requires no authentication, you should say no. I also believe strongly in two-factor, and I also believe that like SMS is not a second factor. Yahoo, I think, did something that was very similar to what Twitter did. Right after I left Twitter, Twitter had a product called Twitter Digits, which was completely ridiculous. It was like they would send you a single link, and you'd click on it, and it would log you in. So you have completely stripped the service of security. The problem is, and I see this in a lot of companies, is that there's this massive fight between, and I don't want to say, it's not the design team. The design team is usually great. But the fight usually is between the growth team, the people that are trying to grow the service, and the security team, because the security team says, you have to stop doing this. You're going to make it, so that we don't have any security in place. And the growth team says, well, we want to reduce user friction. I said, well, yeah, it's called login. If you reduce user friction, then everybody can log in. You can reduce it a little bit, but don't reduce it all the way. So you have to find a balance in designing these systems and designing UX and working with security that says, can I build a system that is still secure, but has a small amount of friction and still lets people log in. And this is that kind of famous security triangle that comes up again and again. It's secure, convenient, or expensive to build, right? And you have to find your position in this grid. Some people say it's like dating, smart, pretty, sane. It goes for men and women. So.
All right. So it seems as if you're an individual, there are several vectors of data sets that can be used against you from a state.
Yep.
Could use that a corporation, or say personal entities could do that.
Yep.
However, you mentioned this briefly about diversity and inclusion. The individuals who often are targeted by the state, by individual researchers or by corporations, aren't the same individuals who often are those security researchers.
Yeah.
So how do we fix that problem where, if, for example, you live in the Palestinian states,
yeah. So I've seen a lot of this through through the OTF, and I've seen some really terrible things, especially in places like.
Or even,
even
the case of doxers, you can think about
so I think
and things
the
like
question
that.
was I'm going to summarize here, but the question was like, if you are a journalist or an activist or one of these people who's in a endangered population, and you're not a security researcher, how do you protect yourself when there's so much going on, right? Yeah. So. There are a lot of outreach groups. For example, Access Now, CPJ, the Committee to Protect Journalists, EFF does trainings I know my wife has gone out and done training with Reuters to teach journalists how to work in war zones. And interestingly enough, I know that a lot of American journalist organizations in the age of that which his name shall not be mentioned, in the age of this time, that they are actually instructing their journalists to act as if they're in an oppressive country with strict anti-journalism rules, because they're trying to protect the integrity of the journalists and to change the way that they respond. So, and this message is coming out of people like CPJ and the ACLU. In fact, ACLU funding has gone up quite a bit in the last year or so.
Secure Drop. Do you want to mention anything about that?
I think Secure Drop's awesome. For those of you not familiar, Secure Drop is a product. It was actually written by some of the people who work in the New York Times newsroom. Secure Drop is also funded by the Open Technology Fund. It is a mechanism for being able to anonymously upload files to a service, which uses a combination of strong encryption and Tor. So you can put a box in the newsroom that someone could come in and drop documents or leak documents into, and do it in such a way that they could not be traced. And I think that's very valuable. We have to support whistleblowers. We have to support leakers. So having the technology to do that is really important to me. One more?
Sure.
Over there.
Oh, man. Wait.
It's okay.
So ever since ISPs have been given the permission to sell user data, so to say, I've noticed that there's a lot of VPNs that have come out there saying, unlimited VPN,
Yeah.
$50, and
Yep.
you get it for a lifetime or whatever. Would you assume that these VPNs are going to be out there selling your data soon enough?
Yeah,
too?
so there was a comment, there was something that I did not bring up in this talk, which I normally bring up in all of my other talks, which is I talk about this magical thing called what is your threat model, right? So if your threat model is, I believe my local ISP will surveil me, then the way around that is to go and use a VPN. But the VPN is only going to get you so far, right? So because at some point, the traffic from the VPN goes out onto the open internet and it's, it could be monitored. So then we would say, okay, if we know that your data is going to be monitored, then what are you concerned about? So the next question might be something like, well, I'm concerned about the content of my data. Great. Never use a website that doesn't use HTTPS. I'm concerned about no one being able to see where I'm going. That's a different problem, because I can always tell what IP address you're connecting to, but I can't look at the content if the content is encrypted. Another service that's very leaky is like DNS, right? So like DNS is not encrypted. So you might go to funsexytime.com, which is like an HTTPS website, but your ISP knows that you did a lookup for that address. So you have to look at the threat that you're facing. So like if I was in a country and I was trying to get around censorship, then my threat is censorship and not where I'm going. I need to get from point A to point B. And the VPN might be the right solution. Or like if you're at a hotel or you're somewhere like SFO that actually issues invalid SSL certificates until you sign up. So and I have to recommend there's tools for this. There's HTTPS everywhere, which EFF creates, which will try to get you out on HTTPS no matter what. And then there's tools like Privacy Badger, which tries to block cookies and block people from tracking you. And these are browser plugins, which are really valuable, and they work in conjunction with a VPN. But I don't think in general, I think a VPN offers a false sense of security unless you control the endpoints. So like for me, I have a VPN server in my house. And so when I'm in another country, I connect to my VPN server in my house, and then I come out through my ISP, and I use Sonic, and I trust them mostly. They've got a good rating from EFF. There actually is a thing that EFF produces called Who's Got Your Back, where they review all of the ISPs, and they tell you who is the most likely to sell your data. So you might want to check that out before you choose your ISP, Comcast. Yeah, so don't use Comcast. Don't use them. It's fast, but
How are we doing on time? What time?
7:23.
Okay, one more question. Well, also, I know this has been a question before, but like if you're going to go with a VPN, how do you find one that you can trust? And do all of them log your data?
Many of them claim that they don't log, but as we saw with the like the Silk Road case, there was certainly people that got caught using VPNs. I can't recommend most of the VPNs. Like I said, it depends where you are and what you're trying to do.
Can I connect to your VPN?
No. Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, I think that's it. Thank you.
I'll be around later if you want to chat.
Awesome. Okay, guys.